Today, the NTSB released a preliminary report on the Casey, South Carolina train crash earlier this month that killed an Amtrak engineer and the conductor, 36-year-old Michael Sella from Orange Park. The NTSB says the Amtrak train was diverted from the main track through a hand-thrown switch into a siding and collided head-on with stationary CSX freight train. This accident damage is estimated to be somewhere around $25 million. So Amtrak transports about 31 million people a year. When trains crash, you often pay.
The reason is complicated, but it boils down to a series of secret agreements between freight railroads like Jacksonville-based CSX and Amtrak. Tonight, Heather Crawford is digging deeper, investigating why taxpayers often wind up footing the bills, and some of these bills are big.
That is right, big bills, Jeannie and Anthony. You know, Amtrak runs the majority of its routes on rails owned by freight companies, and as part of the deal, allowing Amtrak trains on freight rails when there are accidents. Amtrak, which is federally subsidized, is often left paying the bill when its passengers are injured or die, regardless of who's at fault. Now, while that derailment in Casey, South Carolina that killed an Orange Park man is still under investigation, the deadly crash did not come as a surprise to a South Florida woman whose husband was killed in a train crash just about 30 miles from there. She has been sounding the alarm on rail dangers for more than 2 decades.
With each derailment, and there's many, I go back through my depressiveness and I go back through my experience, and I have to remind myself this isn't mine. This is somebody else's tragedy now.
Holding a picture of her deceased husband, Angelica Palenque Charlotte fights back tears when she talks about what happened to him in 1991. Paul Palenque, a Miami police sergeant, was on this Amtrak train headed to meet her and their 2 young children in Washington, D.C. when it derailed in Lugoff, South Carolina, killing 8 people. A doctor on the train who tried to help Paul would later tell her that he was alive for several minutes after the crash.
Paul bled to death.
She learned the switch on the track the train was on had popped open, causing the derailment. CSX was responsible for that track. An NTSB investigation revealed the pin that held the switch together had been broken for some time. Federal law required CSX to do inspections twice a week. A former CSX employee gave sworn testimony that the rail company had falsified inspection reports.
Meaning that they were absolutely derelict in their statutory safety duty in their failure to inspect this switch for at least 10 months before this derailment, and that's what killed and injured all the people on that train.
Angelica's attorney, Chris Searcy, argued that CSX downsized its maintenance staff responsible for upkeeping and repairing the railroad, putting profits before safety. The 17th Circuit Court agreed, saying in its ruling that although cost-cutting measures may have saved the defendant $2 billion, society paid the cost with 8 human lives.
I never abided them saying that Paul died. He didn't just die, he was killed. These people were killed because of financial choices.
After an almost decade-long court battle against CSX, Angelica was awarded one of the largest payouts in a train derailment case, totaling about $70 million. She was shocked to learn that money did not come from CSX. It came from Amtrak's insurance company.
CSX had a contract with Amtrak that said that no matter whose fault it is, where there's an injury on an Amtrak train, even if it's all the fault of CSX's track, that Amtrak has to pay, and they have to indemnify CSX for anything that they pay.
And since Amtrak is subsidized by the federal government, the payout came in essence from taxpayers. Why? Freight railroads have private indemnity agreements with Amtrak, which say in order to use their tracks, Amtrak generally has to pay for the loss of life and injury to people on its trains, even when the accidents are the fault of the freight railroad.
Well, I really believe that every American should, not in fine print on their little ticket stub, know that the railroad is not liable for any behavior. If anything goes wrong on the tracks, the railroad doesn't have to pay for it. The government will pay for it.
As long as these indemnity agreements are in place, Angelica says rail companies have no incentive to put safety before profit.
corporation has no soul. And a corporation with shareholders has a legal obligation to maximize shareholder wealth. So if they're going to maximize shareholder wealth by killing people and let the federal or the state governments pay for those deaths or injuries, then they're not going to practice better business. It's not just the consumer who's suffering. It's every taxpayer that's footing the bills for these dangers to our consumers.
Dangers that took the life of her husband and caused her 9-month-old daughter and 5-year-old son to grow up without their father.
We've got to change our national focus back to caring that the consumer arrives alive and making that primary instead of, you know, what did the stock market close at today?
Now, CSX declined to speak on camera, but a spokesperson said in a statement that safety remains CSX's top priority. We want everyone to return to their families at the end of every day, whether they work on the railroad or live in the communities we serve. CSX's goal is to be the best railroad in North America, and that includes being the safest. We continue working relentlessly toward that objective every day. Now, as for that money Angelica was awarded, she used it to start a foundation in her husband's memory to help abused, neglected, and abandoned children. Heather Crawford, First Coast News, on your side.